Hey baby, I am super late to the party on this one, but as a trauma therapist and an eating disorder specialist, I absolutely have to talk about Jennette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mum Died. Please note, if you have not read this fabulous memoir, there are going to be spoilers. It is no secret that Jennette went through a huge amount of complex trauma at the hands of her family, her employers, and even her religious high control group, which resulted in her using food to cope. So darling, let's briefly discuss the psychology behind why emotional abuse, neglect, and bullying creates eating disorders like bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and anorexia. Did you know, darling, that the number one reason for all eating disorders is actually emotional abuse, emotional neglect, and bullying? In fact, these are also some of the most overlooked types of complex trauma, but let's examine why. When I say trauma, what do you immediately think? A car crash, a traumatic birth, a one-off event of sexual violence? If so, don't worry, that's actually what the majority of people I speak to and work with believe initially. We've been fed an idea that a traumatic event has to be one big bang per se, one major event in our lives that completely throws us off course. But in reality, it's generally much more complex, complicated long-term traumas like emotional neglect or abuse and bullying, which push us to have to cope in ways which damage us. Emotional abuse and neglect are generally very complex types of trauma, as they can go on for such a long period of time without detection by schools and services, if ever being detected at all. They can be so insidious because the people abusing or neglecting us are slowly but surely telling us, either overtly or subconsciously, that we are somehow defective and unworthy of love or affection. Similarly, chronic bullying can lead us to believe that we are a problem and that we're someone who will always be humiliated and ridiculed. These traumas push us to mistrust people and develop a deep-set vulnerability. Low self-worth and low self-esteem. Looking at Jennette's case, we need to consider her mother first and foremost, a person who should have been a safe primary caregiver, but who, from reading her memoir, likely sat on the cluster B scale of personality disorders. Perhaps having borderline personality disorder, known as BPD, or narcissistic personality disorder, known as NPD, as well as having hoarding compulsions. Her emotions were volatile and unstable, and she regularly pushed Jennette into activities such as child acting for her own personal gain. Even if we simply consider just the factor of her very emotionally abusive mother, young Jennette would have had to find ways to cope with all of her repressed emotions, confusion, inevitable resentment, and lack of emotional or physical safety from an extremely young age. And that doesn't even begin to go into her very emotionally void and often absent father and her grandmother, who sounded very similar to her mother. As children, we are incredibly vulnerable and all deserve to feel safe physically and emotionally. But what happens when we aren't? What happens when nobody comes to save us? Well, we have to find a way to save ourselves. When it comes to means of coping with and detaching from our trauma and adversity as a child, we actually have pretty limited options. Food is often an incredibly accessible way for us to find a sense of stability. Restricting food gives us a sense of pseudo-control. Binging helps us to temporarily detach from our traumas and experiences. And purging gives us the physical metaphor that we are getting rid of something bad or defective within us. I hate to say it, but I would also say that Jennette learning her eating disorder from her mother isn't all that uncommon. It can simply manifest in different ways. Whilst Jennette's experience was in fact very overt, her mother quite literally coaching her into anorexia nervosa, often I do see my own patients and clients inadvertently learning their eating disorder behaviours from their own parents due to intergenerational trauma. A good example of this would be the diet culture babies like myself of the 80s and 90s. We were often exposed to our parents and caregivers coping with their unprocessed traumas with yo-yo dieting, fat-free foods, the Atkins diets, which often resulted in binge eating disorder and restriction-based bulimia. However, we have to acknowledge that this wasn't Jennette's only trauma. In fact, the vulnerable position that she was in actually exposed her to a wealth of other adversity. When we're not being safely held by our caregivers as a child or teenager, whether that be physically or emotionally, the wrong type of people will seek us out to abuse our vulnerability in a variety of ways. We can see how much this spirals for Jennette, a boss who she named the creator, but is highly speculated to be Dan Schneider, who emotionally abused her, financially manipulated her, and sexually harassed her. If Jennette was being safely emotionally held at home by parents who loved and nurtured her, who she could turn to in times of need, it's very likely that not only could she have disclosed the abuse in her workplace, but would have never been put into the spotlight against her wishes in the first place. Similarly, Jennette was part of a religious high control group which absolutely would have preyed on her and contributed to her vulnerability, as well as falling into several unhealthy romantic relationships. Unprocessed trauma can quickly spiral in our lives, making us vulnerable with feelings of unworthiness, hopelessness, and often unable to set healthy boundaries for ourselves. But please remember, trauma comes in so many forms: single traumas, complex traumas, global traumas, traumas which other people recognise and others that they don't. But trauma is absolutely relative to your life experience, so please never let anyone minimise your adversities. Jennette is another fantastic example of how unprocessed trauma can manifest and exacerbate eating disorders, but also of how processing said trauma can allow you to recover. She perfectly details her 2 encounters with therapy on her journey so far, showing first the initial chapter of acknowledging her eating disorder, and the second chapter being her beginning to process her incredibly complex trauma. Trauma recovery really does come in chapters, and this can be literally like Jennette moving from therapist to therapist, or more metaphorically. The more trauma we process, the less our eating disorder has to support us with it. It really can be as simple and as complicated as that, and I've been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. If you need help, please do reach out to a registered professional who can support you, darling, and don't forget to lean on your gorgeous support network if you have one. Thank you so much, darling, for choosing to spend the last 7.5 minutes with me. I hope you have a gorgeous day, and if you did like this today, hit the like and subscribe button. It really does help people understand on here that I exist. See you soon, baby.